In this first module, we're going to look at assessment and some of the questions that we'll be exploring throughout the next few weeks. Some of those questions are, what is assessment of student learning? What types of activities fall under that bucket? And what is not student learning assessment? What are student learning outcomes and how do we create them? And then what are direct and indirect measures? And what is the difference between formative and summative assessment? You'll be using some of these things in your discussion in this first module. I want to begin by a quote in the Walvoord book, and that is that assessment is a natural, inescapable human and scholarly act. So when we design learning materials, when we design courses and programs, we naturally ask, well, did they learn it? We want to know what people have learned from the materials we have created. So the assessment process includes 4 things. When we ask, did they learn it? These are the 4 things that actually happen in assessment of student learning. These are taken from the Susky book on assessing student learning. As I mentioned, this is an optional resource, but it is very helpful. So Susky defines assessment as 4 different activities. First, establishing clear, measurable, expected outcomes. So what do we expect the students to learn in this particular scenario? Then ensuring that all students have sufficient opportunities to achieve those outcomes. That's often the hardest part of this process, and we'll talk about that as the semester goes on. Systematically gathering, analyzing, and interpreting evidence. So being strategic about the gathering and analyzing. It's not just about choosing one assessment here and there because you have used them in the past successfully. There's constant adaptation. And then using the resulting information to understand and, most importantly, I think, improve student learning. So if students demonstrated learning the first time I taught this course, there are still ways that I can improve when and how students learn in the future courses. This figure on the right can help you think about this process. It is a cyclical process, so once you use the results, you might go back to refine your learning goals, and then the process begins all over again. Some things that student learning assessment is not. It is not the same thing as grading. So grades are a component of assessment of student learning, but they are not the entire component. We'll talk about that when we look at direct and indirect measures. It is also not program evaluation. So there is, again, an aspect of program evaluation that you would want to know how students are learning, but there's a lot more that goes into program evaluation, including looking at faculty resources, budget, schedule considerations, etc. And same thing with assessment of institutional effectiveness. Student learning is a major component of how well an institution is performing, but there are a lot of other metrics. Fiscal responsibility, for example, the way in which we, have our employees and staff, all of that goes into institutional effectiveness as well. I think the most important on this list is that assessment of student learning is not empirical research. So while we are systematically collecting data and analyzing it, we're not necessarily doing that under a research study or under IRB approval. So that's important to note. It could be that there are some ways in which we can make this more formalized as a research study, but in general, assessment of student learning is not the same thing as empirical research. I thought this quote also would help you to think about what assessment of student learning is, and that is that wherever student learning and development are supposed to happen, there should be goals for that learning and assessments to see how well students are achieving those goals. So that goes back to that figure in that if we are saying that learning happens anywhere, in the classroom, in a study abroad program, in a learning community program, in a civic engagement activity. No matter where it's happening, there should be goals and then assessments that are appropriate for assessing those goals. Student learning outcomes then are a description of what we want students to understand at the end of a course or program. It involves three things. What should they know? So what is the knowledge they're gaining from this? What should they be able to do after this? What are their skills? And what are the values they're getting out of it? How should they feel? What are their reactions? What are their larger takeaways? So we're going to talk about two distinctions. First, direct and indirect assessment, and then formative and summative assessment. And then you'll be ready to begin your posting for this week. So direct and indirect assessment measures are both very important, but it is also good to note what falls under direct and indirect. So under direct, these types of assessments are all rather objective. So we have scores on licensure and certification exams, ratings, portfolios, scores. The important thing here is that most of these types of assignments have some type of score or a rubric associated with them. So there's some clear feedback for the students on what the expectations are and then whether they met the expectations. Indirect can be a little bit tricky, and you might be asking, why are course grades and assignment grades under indirect? It's because they're not always necessarily linked directly to the learning that's happening. So course grades and assignment grades, if they do not have a rubric, they're not necessarily giving feedback directly to the students. We also use things like retention rates, graduation rates, other metrics that accreditation might use as well to be able to say that some learning has occurred. We also then have perceptions and student ratings in this area as well. Finally, formative and a summative assessment. Formative assessment is taking place during the course of the learning experience. So it's happening while someone is studying abroad. It's happening while someone is participating in a psychology course. I thought this quote was helpful as well. Faculty and staff can use formative assessments to improve the learning of current students by making immediate changes to classroom activities and assignments. So it's that there's a prompt reaction, there's an ability to be flexible within the course. Summative assessment then happens at the end of a course or program. So it may be the course grades, it may be surveying students, but effective assessment plans include both types of assessment. So that ends this week's video, and if you have any questions, please send me an email. Otherwise, you can use this information as you begin posting in the discussion forums.